Hello.
For those of you I haven't seen yet today, hi everybody. We're doing the Unconference for after the last 4 talks. I'm Janae Cram. I'm based out of Bellingham, Washington in the United States. And I'm here with Nik Rimington.
Hi everyone. I'm Nick. I'm based in the UK and I work for a gold partner called Spin Dogs who are based in Cardiff. And we are here with Shannon and Mike and Niels and I'm sorry, I cannot. I've forgotten your name. Has it gone?
Yeah.
And Julia.
I'm Julia.
Who are joining us from the studio. So we are here to cover this last segment for today, and we've had some amazing talks. I've just got to say congratulations to all of you. It's been magnificent. There's been so much that I've learned, so much I've got to digest, and so much to understand. I imagine you're probably the same, Janae.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not a big front ender, so I feel like I'm just kind of having a mind blown moment. All this stuff about web components, which my husband does a lot of work in, and I'm like, I have so much to learn, but it's awesome. You made it really easy to parse. I liked all of your presentations about it. And there's a lot of questions that we have for web components and a bunch, of course, that have rolled in at the end here for Shannon on performance as well.
Yeah, so we've had a few questions come in, and the first 3 sessions of this evening have been all following kind of the same areas of Umbraco, and that's the new APIs for the back office and the new UI library. And so I think we'll start with those, if that's all right with you, Janae?
Yeah, that's great. Of course, each of these questions are directed at each of you specifically, but since we had the 3 overlapping talks about web components and the back office in the UI library, I feel like it's fair to say jump in if you have the answer for any of you.
All right, so our first question came up in the first talk, which was Filip's talk. Unfortunately, Filip couldn't be with us this evening, but it was about how does accessibility work with web components? And I think, Mike, it's probably quite a good one for you because I think you touched on it in your talk.
Yeah, sure. So, like I said, web components you can kind of think of them as a shell, right? They don't do anything on their own. They give you the ability to build incredibly complex or incredibly simple things, but it's down to you as the developer to make them accessible. So when I was mentioning about using like correct semantic markup, making sure that you write your code as if, even if it wasn't in the Shadow DOM, for example, as long as you're writing best practice, you shouldn't have too many issues with accessibility. Now, like I said, there are some caveats in regards to, if you have certain an input or label in the Shadow DOM, when you try to connect a label outside, that can cause some issues. Now, the accessibility object model that I mentioned, that is still in the draft, so it's not available just yet. So I would almost say from a progressive enhancement point of view, you probably want to be careful about if you do want to put a label in a Shadow DOM in a custom element, you need to be careful about how you do it. Sorry, an input. Maybe consider including that label within the Shadow DOM just by default, even if it's visually hidden. But yeah. I don't know if Niels, you're obviously with your work and Julia with your work with the UI component library, I imagine you've been facing many interesting obstacles in regards to this.
Definitely, there's some difficulties currently with the Shadow DOM, which is also a strength, but with the current way accessibility is made, we sometimes need to do a little bit more to make it work. And sorry for saying something outside of the scope, but can you be quiet over there? Excuse me?
Yeah.
Could you be quiet? It's a bit hard to do the talk when you're talking this loud. Sorry. So yeah, sorry. There's just some people talking over there in the corner. We can't hear anything.
Shush.
We had the same problem in our talk. Sorry for that, by the way. It's the bad thing I'm not pre-recording, I guess. Sorry. So back to the question. But yeah. Is
okay.
That, did you answer the question? We couldn't hear you because we had someone talking down the road.
Yeah, we were all in the same boat. So did it get answered? Yes?
I believe so.
All right, then I'm going to move on to the next one. I'm just going through these in order, but so I know that there's been a lot of talk around different frameworks for the back office, and I'm pretty sure it was said in multiple spots today that nothing's been decided on, but someone has asked if React can be an option too for the back office. I'm not sure exactly if you have decided on how you're going about things, but did you want to speak a little bit more about some of those future plans?
So it would be great if Filip was here to answer that. But I think I'm relatively sure the answer would be that we haven't decided on that yet.
Mm-hmm.
And the point of the way we've planned the project is to not having to make that decision yet. Because by making the extension API without binding to a certain framework, by making the UI component library without binding to a certain framework, then we have these parts going forward. So if we in the future choose to switch again for a new framework, if we say we choose React tomorrow, right, and we the day after tomorrow choose to use something new again, then property editors that are using the extension API will not have to change. Extensions that are using the UI library component, the UI component library will not have to change. So in that way, we've separated the concerns, and the touch points are framework agnostic, basically. That's at least the point. So if back office will be based on a framework, that should not enforce extensions to use that.
Cool. I think that's pretty a good option at the minute. Something else that someone's asked is, does Blazor have plans to be included into the Umbraco back office with the new components? Now, I've seen that discussion a lot on Twitter, and I'm very curious to see what the HQ's got to say on that one.
Well, I think, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. I can't fully answer the question, but I think someone mentioned it earlier today anyways, that the community thrives really on front-end dev, and a lot of that is JavaScript, HTML, and I know that Blazor can work with that, but doing server-side rendering in Razor isn't everyone's cup of tea. So I don't know. I think that would kind of limit the community intrigue. Though I know Blazor is very interesting to a lot of people in the community, I'm not sure if that would sort of pin us into a different corner. That's my opinion anyway.
Okay.
Does that answer that question?
I think it does. I think the general consensus seems to be that the people that are very C# orientated love the idea of Blazor for the back office, but then when people start evaluating it more, they feel that it's not necessarily suited because it would close it off a bit, and we want to be as inclusive as possible.
Yeah, I don't think it's like a be-all end-all solution for everything on the internet. I think it is very cool though. I'd love to explore it myself too, but I think that going down the more traditional JavaScript HTML route is probably where we'll end up.
Cool. I have a question that actually came up when I was listening to Filip's talk around the APIs and web components, and it was something that I remembered from an early V7 package. And I just wondered whether these new APIs and the web component technology would open up the ability for the Umbraco to allow like multiple simultaneous editing, or for locking the UI if people are already in pages, for example.
Sorry.
If anyone
can we have the question again? Sorry.
So with the use of the new APIs that are being built and use of web components, would it allow for Umbraco to have simultaneous editing of content, which it currently doesn't really support, or the ability to natively lock content when people are editing it and give user-friendly messages? There's a package for V8 and a package for V7 that currently kind of gives that experience, but if it was more baked into Umbraco, it'd be quite an interesting use case.
So in relation to similarity, two people editing the same content at the same time, right? Okay, good. We are not at all at that stage yet. That's definitely a part of the back office implementation, but it is things we are talking about when we are talking about what we would like to get from this this extension API or the way we want things to communicate, that it should be able to do many great things. We're talking about that maybe what if you could work with back office on offline, or how if you are 2 or more people editing at the same time, and all these cases. But I don't think we have any clever answer to any of those things yet. Was that a good answer?
Yeah, no, that was really
Okay.
helpful.
Good.
I've seen people talking about using SignalR to do it, and I think that because Signal is in Umbraco, it could be quite a good way for the feedback. So, whereas seeing what was being demoed with the UI session by yourself and Julia, seeing live updating, and wondering whether that kind of feedback mechanism would tie into it quite nicely.
Live updating, like when someone else is editing content?
It gave the, from what you were talking about, it gave the impression, because of how the scoping works, and how it would be talking to APIs, you could have feedback mechanisms with notifications of changes.
Yeah, but that's definitely a possibility. But we don't have any concrete plans on how or whether or if we'll do so.
Cool.
That's still yeah, exactly. We're still too early in the process.
You heard it here. Collaborative editing coming to the Umbraco back office.
So speaking kind of about how the UI library, which is super, super cool, by the way, I've been hearing the news and kind of some rumors about it going on, but seeing it actually in practice in your presentation was really awesome to watch, you know, the use case of putting it together. We have had a few questions about that. The first one, of course, is people want to know, you know, if they can use it in V8 now, right? Or if it's only going to be available in V9, and what they can do to access it. At the moment, you said you can run it locally. So what are people's options for making use of the UI library at this point today?
So until the first version is sort of ready, I don't think it makes sense for anyone to use it. But when the first version is ready, anyone can use it. And you could, if in theory, import it into V7 if you wanted to and use it for a property editor. But I'm not sure I will recommend this. And I don't think we'll ship V8 with the UI library. And as far as I know, we will not ship it in V9 either. So it is a thing for the future. And
okay.
I think it will come when we have a new back office front end for the back office. At that time, it will be shipped together with the with that version of the back office. So that lies quite a bit ahead.
In the not so distant future.
In the not so distant future.
Not so distant.
in years. Yeah.
Awesome.
But the way it's working, you can import it and use it anywhere. So you could make your own website with it, or
that's the web components magic.
Yeah.
And is there some way for people to get their hands to touch on it now to fiddle with on their own?
Yeah, definitely. It's already an open source repository on our GitHub that you can go clone down and try it out. So yeah, please go ahead and create issues or PRs and so on.
The next question we had about the UI library was regarding CSS, and why scoped CSS compared to global CSS, and why there's a mix of both. I'm taking a guess off the top of my head that it has to do with keeping everything in its specific sections, but people would love to hear more about the specifics for the choices made with that.
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer just like that. But I think today we have some problems with the use of classes, which is often where I guess you would go if you have global CSS. You would have some classes that you're reusing across your application. And the problem with that is you can't change a class, because then you would have to be aware about everywhere it's used or adjust every place where it's used. So the whole idea of the UI and the application evolving is sort of very limited today, because we don't have control over where our styles are used, and also because we have extensions, property editors, and so on, dashboards. that might be using these classes. So generally, today we are completely stuck. If we're changing a CSS class, we probably broke something and we don't know. So with
Yeah.
scoped styling, we will be way more in control of this because we'll know that the styling is only concerned for that given component. So that's just making it super much easier to evolve things. I hope that was an
Great.
answer.
Well, that was perfect.
Yeah, good.
That was perfect. That's exactly the answer that I would have wanted, and I think it is. I think it makes perfect sense for what you're trying to do, to keep everything scoped specifically for where it's used, so that if you need to change something, or if a developer who's making a property or a package in the back office needs to change something, it's only happening on their specific object or on their specific object.
And actually, one thing that might come to some developers is that, oh, but what if I want that same look somewhere? And that's where the sort of the open architecture we've come up with should help you on, because then you should be able to use our components to make those things instead of you using some classes that we made available. So it's a different mindset on the way you sort of style or build UI. And it is still possible to have shared styling, not that we think will go that way, but then it's just done in other ways, like importing a style into a web component. That way we can have things that are shared still and so on.
Does that lead to potentially Umbraco shipping with a small subset of like utility classes for people to use that might help with standardizing on areas where they're not able to use web components, for example, because what they're doing is quite tailored, but they still want the same look and feel? I know there's been talks about it. There's a big advocate in the community for some of the utility frameworks out there, but there's people that like the traditional CSS approach as well.
Yeah, and that's a good question. I can't fully answer that question yet, but I think we can say that we will ship with sort of utility web components. So you have web components that doesn't really make any sense in themselves, but can be used to construct the most common UI and so on. And I don't know or see any reason why not using web components, or who will not be able to do so, because it's just writing HTML.
Because the cool thing about it would be that you could, if you did want to create your own custom property editor or whatever you wanted to make, you do have this full feature-rich library of available components that take all the hard work away from you, right? You just pick what you choose from a store of tasty little web components and make the perfect thing you want to do. But if you want something a bit more advanced from that, or something completely different, then you are completely free to write whatever CSS or JavaScript you want, with the full knowledge that anything you write isn't going to break anything else in the Umbraco back office, which is another really cool feature of using web components in this sort of scoped approach, even using sort of variables going across the Shadow DOM.
Nice, that could be quite cool. So another question we've got asked, and honestly, this one kind of goes a bit over my head, to be honest. So if anyone can jump in on it, that's wonderful. But could we create, or could Umbraco create a design system package so that designers can output directly to web components from something like Adobe XD? When the question was asked, it was linked. There was an example linked to an entry on Microsoft Marketplace for Visual Studio that I believe allows Adobe XD to export straight into Visual Studio Code.
Yeah.
But would that be something that could work with the UI library and Storybook to help people build up and extend their own components?
So I think from the nature of Umbraco and the community, we are a open source community, and it's very much focused around code. So if we did anything that you can use in Adobe XD, then the source of truth would have to be the code, because we'll have many developers who will change the code, and if we manually needed to update XD files for the designers to have something corresponding, we would be working on that for forever. So if we were to make anything for Adobe XD or Sketch or similar products, then it would have to be generated from our front-end code, and that then provide these can you say, design components in these design programs.
Cool.
That's at least my perspective. But I think it will be super cool. It would be super great to be able to open Adobe XD and pull together some Umbraco components to make a sketch for a client, for example.
Nice. So web components is clearly been a big topic this evening. Something that I've not seen that's been asked is what's the overhead of using web components in terms of load speeds? I've noticed that a lot of them are all defined in JavaScript files initially, and you have to then import those into your site. What's the sort of overhead it actually gives?
So it depends on how you want to use them. So a lot of examples come up with that using the JavaScript modules approach, ES modules approach, where each web component is completely encapsulated into its own JavaScript file, and you load that file when you need it, and so on. When you've got HTTP2 working, the overhead's not as bad, but you don't have to build it that way. You could still go to your, you've got a bunch of web components that are going to be fundamentally used for the core part of your site. You always want them to be in there. Why not just, old school, put them all in one big file, make sure they're always loaded. You're not including any frameworks, right? So you're only including the code that is much more succinct, not as dependent on chunky bits of code. So from my perspective, it's not too much of an overhead, but again, it completely depends on how you use them. Again, I'll be interested to see what Julie and Niels have in regards to how they've been considering integrating web components from the library point of view.
Yeah, so we are not landed on a specific solution yet, but I think it's important to note that it's the same problem with React, Vue, AngularJS, and so on, that we have separate components defined in their own file. So I think looking from a performance perspective on that's the same challenge, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's JavaScript, right?
Exactly, yeah.
I guess it also depends on how you build your output, right? I mean,
exactly.
Like AngularJS, we compile or we put the views into the JavaScript so it doesn't load two files. And then if the JavaScript's all combined into one, then it's just one JavaScript file. It's not 100. So it also depends how you get your final result built.
Many different ways to make a cup of coffee.
And that will probably not be defined in the UI library. That will be defined by whoever uses the UI library. So maybe back office will ship with the full UI library, but if you have a website and you just want to use the button from the UI library, then you should also be able to load that component without loading the full package. So it also depends on the case, I think.
Cool, thank you.
So, Mike, you were talking about web components, and you all have been talking about web components and their scope, and we talked about scope CSS. But people are asking if web components are scoped, then how can they talk to each other? Can you give some examples for people who are looking to make their different components interact with each other?
Yeah, of course. So again, it depends on which part of the web component stack you're using, right? If you're using just a plain old custom element, you're not using a shadow DOM, not using a template, you're using a custom element just to wrap around some additional DOM functionality, like a div, for example, a button, then that's essentially just a wrapper. You can use JavaScript however you want to do it. You could use your query selectors to grab the elements you want to connect with something else completely elsewhere in the DOM. If you're using the shadow DOM within a custom element, where I mentioned that when you attach to the shadow DOM, you have that mode option of open and close. If you want to make sure that your elements or whatever you have in the shadow DOM are accessible via JavaScript, if you set that to open, you can still access them. So that's how you can still connect things. So say a common example could be you've got a slider component or carousel component, right? And that may have a bunch of functionality for the main slider, but then you have another custom element for the actual, maybe like the pagination controls or things like that. If you're using something like TypeScript as well, you can reference that other, say the pagination custom element that your slider's using. You'll get all the typed functionality. So say if on your pagination, you have a next button, and that triggers something, triggers an event. You could use your slider component to watch that event, and then they can start talking. Again, it's JavaScript, right? I know I don't want to say it's simple because it's not. It very much depends on how you build your JavaScript. But it's all native stuff, right? There's no special magic here. Apart from the slots, I think slots are magic. They're kind of weird. I haven't used them in really any live projects because I haven't personally found a need for them. But again, the way that we at Yo-Yo use custom elements is more for sort of, doing a brochure-led site or, just for adding some JavaScript functionality. Whereas for building a whole UI library, the context of how you would use web component or custom element is entirely different. Again, it's however you use them works. We don't rely on frameworks because we found since we've used web components, we very rarely need to for the type of work we do. I don't know if I answered the question. I feel like I rambled on.
I think I'm not a JavaScript person, so when you say that it's very complicated, I'm like, or it's easy, I'm like, and so.
But I think the important thing is just that a web component is just a JavaScript class that also can be added to the DOM, and then it turns out to be an DOM element as well. So it can have properties and methods on it, and if you query select the element, you can access those and communicate or do whatever you want, and that's just JavaScript. And yeah, so I guess web components doesn't limit or enforces any specific way to communicate. You could use Redux or whatever if you wanted.
We've been told we need to say bye, haven't we?
We have been told we need to say bye. There are so many questions we didn't even get to Shannon. There's like a bunch more for Mike. Time, it flies. Thank you, everybody, for your awesome presentations and for discussing web components, and Shannon for discussing performance. I hope that we can share these in another place for you to answer all these questions later. There's more for you as well, Mike. So, and give people the solutions that they're looking for. But thank you for your time. We appreciate you and your awesome presentations. They were wonderful.
Chat to everyone later.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.